right. Welcome to the Neither Beg Nor Yield Author Reveal podcast panel. I'm Jason Ray Carney. I teach popular literature at a small liberal arts school in Newport News, Virginia. It's called Christopher Newport University, and it's my honor and privilege to moderate this. And I guess I want to begin with just everybody introducing themselves. I'm not sure how you guys are appearing on your screen, so I'm just going to give an order, arbitrary order. Maybe John go first, Scott second, and then Jason.
Okay.
So please.
Sure, John R. Fultz here. I've been writing professionally since around 2005. All that stuff is online, so I'm not going to go over my various publications, but I do novels and I do short stories and specialize in fantasy, dip into horror every now and then, dabble in sci-fi a little, but mainly I'm a fantasy guy, and most people know that. And by day, I'm a high school English teacher, which I'll be doing again next week after having a fantastic summer off.
I'm there with you. 1 week left of summer break here, so see you.
Oh, great.
Well, thank you. Scott?
Okay. My name is Scott Oden. I also got started in 2005 professionally. My main interest was historical fiction, and then I slid sideways into fantasy. Like John, all my stuff's online if you want to go look for it. I got another one coming out in December, the last book of the Grimner series. And
Part of that.
Yeah, me too. But that's me. I actually do not have a teaching job, so I feel sad. I feel left out.
I don't know. We educators are dealing with smartphones right now and AI. It's very hard. So you don't feel left out.
Well, see, my night job is at a grocery store, and I have to deal with that also. Because
okay.
You can't separate the kid from the cell phone. They die, apparently.
Yeah.
They die. I think so. I think we have some husks of dead children in there.
It's like a Borg drone if they get disconnected from the collective.
That's what we're becoming. We're becoming the Borg with we just haven't integrated it into our brains yet, but we will. Yeah. That's coming. Pretty soon.
Like
Good morning, Father. How are you?
It's like an ant that wandered away from the rest of the hive, and they're just meandering around aimlessly in the ice cream aisle.
I have a phone safe. I throw my smartphone in the phone safe if I'm reading or something. I have to do it because my palms get itchy. So.
Flip phone.
Flip phone. There you go.
I'm a step away from a Luddite right now.
Jason.
All right. I'm Jason Waltz. I am not a professional writer. Still working on that. I started in the publishing side of things, though, also in 2005. Volunteering in 2003, but on my own in 2005. So that's pretty interesting. We have that year in common. We're gathered here. These gentlemen are gracious enough to appear in what is going to be Rogue Blades Entertainment and my last anthology, 100% concentration on sword and sorcery, titled Neither Beg Nor Yield.
Sounds great. So a lot of the details of the curriculum vitae will come out in the course of the conversation. And specific titles and stuff like that. People were reluctant to go into their various publications, but I'm sure that stuff will come out. Okay. All right. So first question. Writers are sometimes pigeonholed as being a certain kind of writer. I know John and Scott both have strong opinions about sword and sorcery, but for better or worse, I would say a lot of your diehard fans and readers, think of you as like a sword and sorcery writer. This is a sword and sorcery anthology, right? That we're kind of doing this author reveal for. So how okay are you with this label of being a sword and sorcery writer? And why do you follow up? Well, why do you think people consider your work sword and sorcery? What about it, allows that pigeonhole to work, if you will? Maybe start with John.
Well, I've never, I grew up reading sword and sorcery, but I never really embraced it for my own work because at the time I started, it was sort of a bastard medium, or was a bastard genre. Nobody wanted anything to do with it. I'm so glad to see that changing, and the groundswell of support for the new, I guess you call it a movement. It's not really a movement, but it kind of is. I mean, it would be a movement if we could unite everybody, but we can't seem to get united. But there's a lot of people writing and reading sword and sorcery again. And there's great sword and sorcery comics again. And for a long time, you had to look far and wide to find that stuff. So I just call my work fantasy because it's such a catch-all term. But I think the reason that I never got published in any of the mainstream, big paying markets is because it's too close to sword and sorcery, what I write. And everybody was like, oh, that's 2 decades, 3 decades out of date. And I'm like, no, it's not. Read the damn story, So what I try to do is I try to take the whole concept of pulpish adventure, sword and sorcery, and elevate it by applying literary values to it. And it's really not that complicated. I want my heroes to be as believable human beings as my villains. And I want to tell stories that have some grasp of human nacher and that tell you something about human nature. And along the way, there'll be a lot of broadswords and dragons and, otherworldly creatures to slay, a lot of combat, a lot of battles. I don't know why. It's just something in me. It's probably because I grew up, my first literary loves were Tolkien and Howard. So somewhere in the middle, you've got kind of what I write. It's not as optimistic and sort of utopian as Tolkien, but it's not as dark and damned as the Hyborian Age, but it's somewhere in the middle. And also depends on what I'm in the mood for. Some stories cleave more toward that way than others. But I'll tell you one thing. My first the first series of stories I ever wrote, the Zhang cycle, I called it Pen and Sorcery because the protagonist was actually a writer. And he ended up being a sorcerer, but he came to sorcery through writing. And I wanted to explore the links between art and sorcery. And that book, not to plug, is finally getting a second edition. So it's going to be coming out again later this year.
Oh, that's awesome.
But Pen and Sorcery was my sort of way of taking sword and sorcery and giving it a more cerebral approach. But with other stuff that I've written, it may be more straight ahead sword and sorcery. I just don't like to label myself. I like to write whatever I'm inspired to write. But that's where my origins come from, is from what used to be called sword and sorcery and is now being called that again, I guess.
So intriguing. Like Rusty Burke, when I talked to him about sword and sorcery, like he really doesn't like that term. Like I feel like in the past it was like a pejorative. It doesn't have that ring to me at all. Like I hear it sounds cool, So it's just intriguing.
What depends on how old you are. Is if you remember the 80s, early 80s, 70s was great. Sword and sorcery was everywhere. In the 80s, it started getting like really horrible movies started coming out and giving the genre a bad name, and bad books too, and then bad comics. And anything that goes on and gets really popular is going to fade into trash eventually. And then it comes back around, So I think it's because of the glut of subpar writing and films in the 80s that kind of took this thing Conan the Barbarian is a masterpiece. 1982. I'll argue about that for hours and have. But you compare that to the second one and it shows you that one was a cartoonish buffoonery type thing, and that doesn't mean you can't watch it, but it's not going to have the impact that the first movie did because they said, look, half the budget and make it kid friendly, dude, for this one. And they did. And that's why you have the rubber faced monster and all that stuff. Anyway, I've said too much, so let me pass the baton.
So Scott, what do you think of this label, sword and sorcery writer? Is this something that you embrace, something that you kind of, ambivalent toward?
Oh no, I embrace it wholeheartedly. I enjoy being a sword and sorcery writer. When I started out writing, I started out by copying Robert E. Howard word for word. And I'd sit down with the stories in the 8th edition, and I'd start typing them out on a typewriter. And when I felt the need, I would start adding my own stuff. And that's basically how I learned to write, was copying what I thought would be the best sword and sorcery stories ever. And it followed me into adulthood. So my problem when I was younger, when I was writing, is I could not create a believable background. You hear all this stuff about world building, about, I didn't feel like I could do that. So I copied history instead. And, my first novel was supposed to be, in my mind, a Conan pastiche for Tor. Except they went out of business before I got finished. So I had 3 chapters of a Conan novel and nothing to do with it. So a friend of mine who was actually selling stuff, he had several books out. He suggested I turn it into something my own. And I was at a loss, so finally turned it into historical fiction. So I had my Conan clone. I had my version of the Hyborian Age, which is 26th Dynasty Egypt, and that's where I got started. So I fully embrace the sword and sorcery label, and
that's really fascinating. I've heard of writers who will type out a writer they admire's work, and then kind of just to kind of get the cadences and the style down. That's really intriguing. And Rusty Burke.
See, that was.
Oh, sorry. Rusty said you're the I'm trying to, I don't want to misquote him, but he said that you are writing in a way that is most like Howard. Of contemporary sword and sorcery writers, he feels that your style is very similar to Howard's. It was a compliment. It was very much a compliment.
Oh yeah, I love Rusty. Rusty is the reason I got a job writing Conan stories for Marvel.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I was like, do I know anybody that knows anybody that's in charge there? And he apparently told him, hey, you should look at this guy's work. And suddenly I get a call from him, and would I like to write a novella? So
that's awesome.
Very nice.
That was a great series too.
You're actually going to pay me for that? Oh, thank you. But I learned that the rewriting other writers, they used to teach that and push that real heavy in Writer's Digest in the 80s and 90s. That was one of the cornerstones of learning how to write, was to pick up somebody you admired and write their prose. And then when you started to feel the muse moving you, you added your own. And but that was how they taught people to write at the time.
I'm gonna have to try that now.
It's interesting.
I thought everybody did something similar to that, but apparently not.
So, Jason, do you want to add anything to this about this label of sword and sorcery writer? Like, are you okay being a sword and sorcery writer?
Put it this way. I would love, actually, to be known as a sword and sorcery writer, but the few times that I have completed a story, sent it out into the world, and called it sword and sorcery, it never gets accepted anywhere. So I am failing miserably at being able to write sword and sorcery. I write heroic fantasy, though. That is my favorite genre. I have dabbled in crime and thrillers and things like that. Nothing published. But what I like about these two gentlemen is a lot of what they said. Scott brings the historical angle to his SNS, and John brings more of the horror, but also the purple of Clark Ashton, or even of not a Vance, Silverberg, is who I was thinking. Sometimes it's a little too much for me. I love John's short stories. I enjoyed his characters in the Shaper series, but you got a little purpley for me in that one, brother.
I prefer phantasmagorical, thank you.
Okay, there you go.
There is this one sentence in one of your stories, John, I can't remember, where you were describing a battle, and there are like witches riding spiders as purple lightning is in the background. I was just like, it was just, it was jumping the shark in the best possible way.
It must have been from the Revelations.
There needs to be a van with that on it.
Exactly.
Well, I have to tell you guys, my first novels were criticized because people were like, oh, there's too much description, there's too many adjectives, there's too much of this and that and other bullshit. And I was like, don't read it. If you don't like it, don't read it. Secondly, I want to see a world when I read fantasy. I want to see weird shit that I can't see in the real world. I want to see Technicolor skies and, marching hordes of hell. I want to see these things. I want to see, I want to smell the stink on the alleyway. I want to get in there. And some people just can't handle it. They want the action. Go, 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 because they're Twitter minds. They have Twitter minds. They want 150 characters. I'm not talking about Jason, but I'm talking about people who write bad reviews and say, too much description. Don't describe so much. It's like, don't read it. If I'm going to continue describing. But here's the thing I've tried to master over the last 20 years, trying to simplify my style while still being as evocative with imagery as I possibly can. That I studied Dunsany when I want to know that, because it was Schweitzer who pointed out to me that Dunsany didn't use a lot of adjectives. He used very simple language very effectively with metaphor and figurative language. And so that's what I try to do. And I think you'll find that anything I've written in the past 10 years is got a simpler style than the early stuff. And that's because it takes a while to shed your influences as a writer. And for me, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, all the stuff that I love, it's sort of just like it found its way into my writing. And writing for me has been a process of stripping these things away. It's like they say you have to kill your darlings when you write. Like, oh, that sentence is so beautiful, but you got to kill it if it doesn't serve the story, move the story along, right? So that's been my personal journey, going from what people call purple, because I never was comfortable with the purple prose thing. To me, it's beautiful prose. I was insulted until I read that someone called Tanith Lee's prose insulting. And I'm like, that's one of the greatest writers who ever walked the planet. So if you think she's purple, I will gladly take the purple.
That's hilarious.
And understand, John, you wouldn't be in this conversation if I didn't like your storytelling.
I know. I appreciate it. Thank
you. You were talking about reviews, and I think this goes back to the label. Fans will use labels in one way to try to tell their other, their friends, like, you should, if you like that, you might like this. So he's a sword and sorcery writer, you might like this sword and sorcery writer. But I think as writers, we sometimes experience labels as constraining, like it's a formula that we have to follow. So I always try to think maybe labels don't work for writers, but for fans and readers, they work for them. But
the problem is, most readers don't understand the label. They will label anything with swords and magic as sword and sorcery.
Right?
And
exactly. It's like this in every artistic
Harry Potter
field,
sword and sorcery.
Right.
It's the same thing in music. All the grunge bands never wanted to be called grunge. All the metal bands, it took them 20 years before they finally said, okay, let's embrace the metal label. Yeah. I think artists don't like to be pigeonholed. I know stoner rock bands don't want to be called stoner rock, even while they're smoking weed. Like, we're not stoner rock. So I think it's just that artists urge to not be, pigeonholed into one.
But is that the artist? Is that the artist being basically a prick? If you're a stoner rock band, if you're smoking pot and you're doing rock, you're stoner rock. It doesn't matter what you consider yourself.
Yeah, it's just one of those things,
rock.
There is this history. Oh, I'm sorry.
I remember being in a band back during the grunge heyday, and we used to argue whether we were grunge or not. We were like, "Are we grunge? No, man, we're not grunge. We're psychedelic metal."
That's hilarious.
The drummer then goes, "We're grunge."
Yeah.
Musicians, the way they get granular with their various types of music, the different subgenres, it's so much more OCD than in the literary world. It's I can't even begin.
Oh no. Writers get just as bad. Writers are just as bad.
Cozy
punk,
punk,
saber punk, stabby in the head punk. I don't know, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
they will create a new label and then declare that they hate labels.
Yeah.
Here's where it went too far for me. When in response to Grimdark, someone created Bright Hope.
Right.
Bright Hope. Where's the drama in that?
Is it Bright Hope?
Noble Bright.
Noble Bright. Yes. Yeah.
All right. I want to ask my next question. I wrote these questions and I want to ask them.
Okay.
So you mentioned influences, and I like that idea of part of a writer's journey is kind of slowly but surely shedding their influences and kind of finding their unique voice. Like that's really intriguing. But with that said, what kind of reading has most influenced you guys? And this doesn't just have to be fantasy, horror, and sci-fi. It can be philosophy. It can be history. Scott mentioned history, and I have a follow-up question. But I guess I'm interested in like just kind of general reading that has influenced your writing. Maybe start with Scott and then go to John.
Okay. I have a guilty admission. I do not read most fantasy. I don't read 99% of sword and sorcery that's produced. A lot of it reads like an imitation of an imitation. To me, the things that help me the most is reading outside the genre of fantasy. Westerns are great for learning how to write fantasy, because that's basically all it is.
Right.
It is the lone gunslinger is the sword and sorcery hero. Give him a sword, throw some giant spiders in there, and off you go. But the most useful things I've ever read are Mary Renault and Stephen Pressfield.
Okay.
In terms of building a world that seems believable. That's my other problem with reading a lot of fantasy, is the world that they're presenting is surface level. There's no depth to it. The words don't mean anything. The names. There's no mention of history to the words. So it's the problem that I always had with Lynn Carter and his some of these introductions he would write to some of these books, where he'd talk about, he would yank these names out from nowhere, and like the Purple Towers of Zabulba or something like that. To me, that's gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. Whereas if you tell somebody about Thebes of the Thousand Gates, then there is a cultural DNA to it. Everybody knows what Thebes, everybody knows what Memphis, what Cairo. We've had generations to build something around these names. That is the genius of Tolkien. He was able to condense thousands of years of history in his own mind, creating languages that had something that meant something, and not just a random collection of vowels and consonants that made no sense. So, I'd never cared for horror, so I'd read very little horror. Used to read cyberpunk when I was a teenager, but the leap in writing came for me when I started reading historical fiction.
Really intriguing.
Because, one of my favorites is Robert Harris, and he wrote a trilogy about Cicero. And there are so many little details that would be great carried over into a fantasy world, but nobody ever carries them over into a fantasy world. And it's to me, ancient history is no different from fantasy, because we don't know what the world was actually like. So we're creating basically a pop culture version of antiquity.
Right.
But it's
that point.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was going to say that point you brought up about the cultural DNA and being able to kind of recognize associations. I think that's one of the reasons why Howard's fantasy is so visceral and we connect with it, is because even though we're relating with Stygia, it's Egypt, or there's a reality there's a verisimilitude to it. That's part of his love of history. I think
he grabbed onto that, I guess, pretty early. As far as I know, he was the first person to grab onto that idea that you can create a fantasy world using names that are already well known to historical readers or archaeological readers, and create a image in as few words as possible simply by using these ancient names. Like you can say somebody is from Corinthia, and you're going to know that there's some kind of Greek aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
Aquilonia, you're going to know there's some kind of medieval French because it sounds like it belongs.
Some writers, I don't want to get negative, but like David Eddings and his quasi-historical cultures kind of suck, in my opinion. But
no negativity.
Yeah, no negativity. I know people like David Eddings.
Well, but he's dead, so you can do that.
There you go. John, what are some influences? And I guess you don't have to respond, but the question that Scott answered was the non-fantasy, the non-science fiction horror. Do you want to talk about that, like your non-genre influences? Do you have non-genre influences?
Absolutely. I think Scott, you hit the nail on the head. If you want to create fictional worlds, you have to study history, and you can never. Studying history is something you can never complete. Like, oh, I'm done with history now. It's an ongoing process, and if you have a fascination with history, you'll probably do pretty good at your world building. And vice versa. If you're a good world builder, you're going to naturally be drawn to history, writing, movies, all of that stuff, the way we see it. And I've always loved period pieces, movies, because it's kind of like a fantasy, like you were saying. When you're watching something that's set 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or more, there's just a lot of that being made up out of whole cloth, and this is one reason I love Roman dramas so much, because it's literally is another world. Right now I'm watching Domina on MGM Plus, and it's fantastic. It's probably the best. Well, Britannia was good, but HBO's Rome kind of set the whole new bar for that.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I guess. Anyway, but yeah, historical stuff, definitely. I've always loved history. But when it comes to writers, I think William Gibson had a big impact on me. I started reading him in college. And even though he was a cyberpunk writer, what I enjoyed about him was the way something I strive to do, simplicity of language, and yet completely deluged with imagery and detail. I don't know how Gibson rams so much detail into one page, but he never uses a complex sentence. It's like, wow, this guy really knows how to. Laird Barron can do this too. It's like, how did he get all that in my head without these long Nathaniel Hawthorne style sentences? Like I was complaining when I tried to read Nathaniel Hawthorne that by the time you finish one of his sentences, you've forgotten the first part of the sentence. So I always try to teach my students. They think they're supposed to write big, long sentences because their science and history teachers tell them that. But I always say, as your English teacher, write shorter sentences, and that way you'll avoid the run-ons and wandering off topic. But anyway, back to authors. Of course, I read. If you've seen any interviews with me, I love Clark Ashton Smith and Tanith Lee and Robert E. Howard and so on and so on. But when it comes to outside the genre, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is someone who also inspires. Now he does the opposite. He has paragraphs that are 2 pages long sometimes.
Yeah.
And he just, as far as the unrestrained imagination goes, he doesn't write anything resembling sword and sorcery, but he's writing fantasies about this imaginary version of South America, which is really based on the real South America, but it's more fantastical and miracles happen and magic is real and all this stuff. And that book inspired the hell out of me. And like I said, thematically different. Some other stuff I read in college was Robert Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land. That book just makes you look at reality in a whole different way. And to me, that's one of the highest art forms you can achieve with the written word, is just basically making you come up from the page and then see things a new way somehow. And there's been a few other books over the years that have done that. But I never liked Heinlein's style because he didn't have any of that phantasmagorical stuff. He was very economical with words, but the story that he told was just sort of a mind expanding story, with the character Michael Valentine, who was raised on Mars by Martians. And so he has more of a Martian outlook than a human outlook. It's a classic book. So I think when you're a writer, you're always looking for stuff outside of the genre. And I also feel you, Scott, when you say you don't read any fantasy. Sometimes I feel guilty because there's so much fantasy coming out, but I don't read maybe 1 or 2% of it. And sometimes I buy it, but it's there because as a teacher, I don't have time to read much. I'm reading papers all the time. Then during the summer, I'm trying to get my own writing done. And in the back of my mind, I go, well, if I want to be original, then I don't need to be reading other fantasy. I need to be reading outside the genre because that's very important, and I try to do that. Crime fiction, also love hard case crime. They have lots of great books. Like you mentioned, Westerns. I don't read a lot of Westerns, but I love to watch Westerns because, like you said, they're basically the same template as Sword and Sorcery. But yeah, everything I read
I feel
on my writing, whether it's fantasy or not fantasy. And when I got into teaching, I started teaching these great classic books and taking stuff from them, learning stuff from them. Like how Steinbeck does this and how so and so does that. And really, great writing is great writing, regardless of the genre. And I also heard that say, rest in peace, that he didn't listen to rock music. And that blew me away. I was a teenager at the time, guitar player. And I was like, how is it that Eddie Van Halen, the greatest guitar player in the world, doesn't listen to rock? Well, it's probably the same reason. He makes rock all day. At night, he wants jazz to relax.
See, you had a comment. Oh, sorry.
I feel bad. Yeah, I feel bad sometimes about not reading fantasy. Because right now I'm rereading The Lord of the Rings. There's a ton of great fantasy out there. I'm rereading The Lord of the Rings. I just finished reading a cozy fantasy, Legends and Lattes. But people will send me books to read, and I'm like, yeah, I'll read that, and I'll put it on my shelf, and I'll start it, and I'll never finish it. And I don't really know why.
I think it's just part of most of the stuff we really love. We read when we were kids, and we had a lot more time to waste. Now we're adults. We got jobs and mortgages and shit, and we don't have as much time to play D&D or read our favorite fantasy books or whatever.
Lord of the Rings is relaxing to me. To read that is relaxing. It's like going home. So.
You guys make me think like I'm a hog at the trough, just like eating whatever is slopped out, because I read a lot of Warhammer novels and D&D novels, and I'm like,
I read the hell out of some Warhammer 40K.
I'm a Philistine, I guess. Do you want to comment on this, Jason?
I want to comment on a couple things. First, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Rappaccini's Daughter is my favorite classic short story of all time.
Oh, I got to read that one.
I did a whole term paper on that in a literary class one year.
It's a good story.
I forgot my other comeback. Reading current. Again, I'm not published like either one of these guys. History. I like history until Rome. I hate Rome. I like everything pre-Rome. Carthage. I was a big Hannibal buff also, but never came up with Howard's Andrew Jones's stories here.
Hannibal. Yeah.
But talking about things that influence my writing, I'm a big. I was in the Marines, so I like Marine history. My grandfather was in World War II, and researching his history in the Army. I have a big military World War II specific Marine Corps history with a lot of biographies. And Howard references reading Audie Murphy and all of his things. Reading all of those firsthand accounts of jungle warfare in Vietnam or whatever, and the things that actually had to live through the Bataan Death March, stuff like that tied in with Westerns. And I do read a lot of fantasy, a lot of heroic fantasy, the whole spectrum of it. And talking about time, I used to be one of those guys until I was about 44-ish. I could count on one hand how many books I hadn't finished in my life. I finished everything. And then I said, life's too short. I don't need to finish shit I don't like. So in the last decade, I've managed to just toss books that, probably roughly when you hit the 90, 100-page mark, if it's not me, I'm done. Which, the first 2 years was very hard for me to do. But I don't also reread. I'm going to do a plug for my boy. He's the first guy who's gotten me to reread them in my entire life. As a kid, I reread Lord of the Rings and Huckleberry Finn. I read those over and over and over again. But Malazan, Book of the Fallen, I like my Steve Erickson, and I have reread several of those books. And again, I haven't done that in 30 years, reread anything. I don't have time, in my opinion. There's too many things to read.
That's interesting.
I just started Howard's book, and I'm slowly moving through that. And I'm getting ready to go back to teaching, so that's going to be even slower. But it's just something I really want to read,
Yeah.
And the Hannibal book, and I was really excited for what Howard's doing. And speaking of sword and sorcery, we probably wouldn't even have this discussion if Howard hadn't been rebuilding the credibility of sword and sorcery for the past 15, 20 years.
20
you know,
years.
he's
Yeah.
kind of like the vanguard of the whole.
He's
new
the
age,
Moses of the sword and
contemporary.
sorcery. He's our Charlton Heston leading us out of the wilderness.
Trying to part the Red Sea right now with his staff.
Yes, I like to think of him as Taylor
Let
with
my
Nova
people
on the back
go.
of the horse, riding towards the sea. You know.
I just imagine Howard with this big beard now. Real quick, you said after 44 you stopped reading books that weren't doing it for you. It still pains me to give up on a book, but I find myself doing that more and more these days.
I think as you get older, you have to, man, because you don't have as much time.
Yeah.
And you're like, I only want to expose myself to the best of the best. Wow.
A lot of what I do is I get into these IPs, and I feel like it's almost like when you're reading this weird Warhammer novel, you want to know the lore for that particular, you know, and so you're reading it like, oh, but if I don't finish this, then I won't. But anyhow, so
Well,
I want to.
I think what helped me do that actually was being an editor. After the first 5 years, I changed the submission policy for Rogue Blades. When I had open calls, I only took the first 500 words. And if you hadn't sold me on the way I did it was I got the first 500 words, and if you hadn't sold me, it was a rejection, and I would tell you why. If the 500 words bought me, I asked for the rest and sent that to my slush readers, and then they had their parameters, and if it passed them, then I would read the whole story. But so many things. People work really hard on their beginning. 2 paragraphs. That's why I went up to 500 words instead of just that 250 mark. And then I don't know, it just falls apart after that, or so many things aren't what you ask for. So I think that helped me realize that I always felt I owed it to the author to find out what he was trying to tell me at the end of that story.
That's interesting.
That was why I always wanted to finish everything, and then realized there's no time for that.
You know, I have to
got
say
a question for you.
that is a very classic approach. Because back in the day when you could make money from selling short stories, I've read Harlan Ellison and Bob Silverberg talk about this. The hook. If you didn't have a good hook, you didn't make a sale. Yeah. Somehow that went out the door. But I still have that ingrained in me. And if I read the first page of a short story and it doesn't grab me, I'm not reading the rest. I'm sorry. Life's too short. I'm not an editor. I don't have to read it. And every time I get an anthology or a magazine, I skim through and I see which of these stories are going to grab me in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. And if they don't grab me, if they don't hook me, then I'm sorry. Give me another one with a better lead. And I feel like more editors should be saying, this story needs a better lead. You got an interesting story, needs a better lead. And I can't tell you how much I've been frustrated by the lack of good leads over my career of reading other people's work. Because that's the thing I work the hardest on. I go back and do the beginning over and over and over sometimes, obsessively, because to me, it's your first impression, so, but yeah, I think you're right. And I think editors used to be a lot more like that, Jason, where like, hook me if you want me to read this. But Scott, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. You're good. But I wanted to ask Jason Waltz a question, because I used to read slush for a literary agent, and I did it for 9 months. And in that entire 9 months, I never found anything to kick upstairs to the agent, because everything fell into 2 groups. Either the person could write, but they did not know how to tell a story, or they knew how to tell a story, but they could not write.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's still the case now when you see your slush stuff.
Yes. So my criteria to my slush readers was my criteria for myself, other than I would determine if the beginning hooked me. It had to meet what RB stood for, heroic adventure. We started heroic fantasy, but then I expanded it to heroic. So if it ain't that, out the door. B, storytelling, just pure old grandeur of storytelling. For example, I think Stephen King is a good storyteller. I hate his books. I hate reading his writing. I don't think he's a good writer. I will listen to his stories. I'll watch, I'll have people tell him his short stories are better than his novels. So for me, you need to be a good storyteller, better than more than a good writer. And then the third thing is semantics. All of the ability to write, the scope of how much work is it going to actually take to work with you to fix this story. If I love the first two things, and if I love the first two things, weighed against the work, does that, I'll get up here, does that balance out? Am I willing to invest that time? I was lucky when I started because I started in the old SF Reader forums, and that's where I met. That's how I got into this. I started submitting to my first things there. I started slush reading, then selection reading, and then got into this publishing through that. And a lot of my authors were all the people that I would send stories to for feedback on when I started. And now I was making decisions on their work, which was very scary at the beginning, quite honestly. And I learned back and forth, like Rob Santa, Bruce Durham, guys who wrote great stories, taught me, helped me learn how to be a writer. But now I'm saying, can you tweak this, or can you change this, or can you give me a hook here? Stuff like that. So I think I was very blessed without realizing it, that my audience was most of my writers were most of my readers, which is part of one of the Sword and Sorcery conversations right now. I was quite happy on the Discord, which to me is the 2020s version of the SF Reader of the early 2000s. This is where the SNS conversation is on the Discord, the Whetstone Discord, and I tell everyone to come here. John came over the weekend.
Oh yeah, thanks, John.
I think that the Logan or Chris or whoever it was who threw out the stats from the magazines, I was quite astounded that the informal survey, was it Joseph? Anyway, it's somewhere in the thread talking about it's actually less than 5% based on their querying of or comparison of readers, subscribers, and submitters. And I was astounded by that because if someone had asked me, I would have said 50 to 60% of your readers are your writers. It's just a vicious circle because we're so small. So I'm thrilled by that. I would have been happy with anything under 25, and they're saying it's under 5%.
Awesome. Out of how many respondents, though? That's the trick.
Yeah, I don't know the stats behind the stats, and I know we can manipulate them, but I don't really see why he would manipulate it. There's nothing to his advantage to go either direction,
No, I don't think he would manipulate them. I think it was Logan who did that survey. Yeah. I don't think he would manipulate them, but if it's a small group, it's less reliable statistic than if it's a bigger group.
Right.
I took statistics in college, and that's the only thing I remember.
Yep.
Luke E. Dodd is a laboratory scientist. He does statistics. He's a big numbers guy. We should talk to him and see what he thinks about the statistical validity of the. But before we move on to the state of publishing, I do have questions about like the Sword and Sorcery community and like publishing. But I want to ask one more like kind of. I'm not sure how to categorize this question, but I'm proud of this question. I want to ask it. So how about sometimes writing can be a way of like dealing with our psychodramas. Have you noticed any patterns in your writing? Like, are you enthralled by any particular tropes or characters, villains that recur, conflicts? Like, do you have what like a critic would call like thematic preoccupations? Maybe start with John and then Scott.
I'm sure I do because I think all writers do. Friend of mine once told me I write the same story over and over, and there's only so many times I can do that. And I thought, no, you don't. They're all great. But then I look at his work and I see patterns. I think we all have patterns and we all have obsessions. We all have hangups. Sometimes we try to work those hangups out in our fiction. Other times we face our fears in our fiction. Other times it's just like, hey, I've always wanted to do this and I can do it in fiction. I think one of the things that when you're a fantasy writer, one of the things that you might be channeling is your desire to control the world. You can't control the world, and you have to accept that as an adult eventually. And when you realize some things are out of your control, you can't sit around and worry about them all day. You'll worry your life away. But in a story, you can control literally everything. You can control the cosmos, the gods, everything, right? So there's part of that. You're a little god playing with your toys. I think, too, some people are obsessed with various aspects of existence that come out. Horror writers, for example, are obviously obsessed with the horror behind the banality of daily living. I don't know if I can really pinpoint my own hangups, though. I'm sure someone else would be glad to study and criticize and do that. But I just get it out there, and I don't worry too much about it. I mean, we all write because we have to write, not because we want to. And who would want to be in this crazy screwed up business,
Yeah.
But that's something you'll hear from all creative people, because there's creativity and then there's business. And when the two meet, it can be very hectic and very challenging. And yeah, it can be recipe for disaster sometimes. So I think we write because it's something in us and we got to get it out there,
How about you, Scott? Do you have any themes that you focus on, or any character? I have some thoughts on your Grimnar character. So,
You should let me tell you in private about my life, and then you'll see. Yes, Grimnar is therapy. I cannot slaughter villages of people in real life, but I can do it in fiction. And it's cathartic. It's I will, in most of my fiction, revisit the same themes, mainly a world passing away. I've always had a fascination with that one. A lost home and vengeance. So those are every story, with the exception of one I wrote for my wife on her birthday, has all those themes. And it's there. It's how I can't afford therapy, so I write stories where the main character does the stuff that I cannot do. So
now that you say that, I think that some of mine are like the individual's battle against the omnipresent state of like the power structure.
Yeah,
that always shows up in my work. The underdog battling against the power structure. And there's probably some other things too, now that
they always have the ability to tear down the power structure,
which we don't.
Right?
Which we don't.
We don't.
How about you, Jason? Do you have any? I think that story you wrote for Whetstone, The Last Centaur. I could do. I could put on my weird scholarly hat and do some analysis of that story. I think there's some interesting things going on in that. Do you have any? Comment on that story, but do you have any thematic preoccupations?
My theme is, I grew up on Westerns. I came to Howard through Westerns, but I need to caution that doesn't mean I found them through Breckenridge. I made that mistake my first visit to Howard days, when they always ask, how'd you find Howard? And I said through Westerns. And then everyone introduced me as, he found Howard through Breckenridge. And I had to backtrack and say, no, I grew up on Max Brand, Luke Short, Louis L'Amour, and all the solo guy going across. Then I found Tarzan and John Carter, and Carson, who I like better than John Carter, by the way. And then I found Conan, because the Conan covers look like the Tarzan covers. So my thematic theme, most of my stuff is the lone, or there'll be an occasional sidekick, but pretty much the predominant character is the throat punch to the world that and needs to save. Not a destined to save, but I like to think I write more Conan-ish characters, even if it's not sword and sorcery. My Direk is my favorite personal character that I have the most stories about, and he's not sword and sorcery, but he's torn by duty and loyalty and betrayal because of his duty and loyalty. So duty and loyalty, which are actually, I should have said that from the beginning, all my favorite movies are all about loyalty and often betrayal.
It's really fascinating. So I have
that I want to make one comment about the story you mentioned. That is the first and only story I specifically wrote about a specific emotion. I will be fair. I was given the picture as a prompt to write a story for it, but I immediately thought sorrow, and the whole point was to write as evocative of a sorrow as possible. That was the motivation behind that story. And then I got my evil twist at the end, just hit me out of the blue.
It's really interesting. So I have some questions about like sword and sorcery as a community, the current state of publishing. So maybe we've been talking mostly about influences to kind of shift gears a little bit. Maybe to start with your thoughts on the community as a whole. If the community even exists, we might be fooling ourselves. It might just be like 50 really active people on the internet, or there really is this kind of group of people who are really into this. So is there anything that you could say about the current sword and sorcery community? Like, what do you think's going on? Does sword and sorcery have an appeal right now? Why so? Like, is there a renaissance? Thoughts about like sword and sorcery today, if you will.
I'll start.
Oh, please, John. Yeah.
You don't mind? The other day I was blown away because on the same day we had Howard's book, Lord of Shattered Land. We had the first issue of the brand new Conan the Barbarian comic, which is amazingly good. Thank Crom. And we had the first issue of Fire and Ice. The Frazetta Bakshi legendary animated film is now a comic book with art by Leo Manco, who's no slouch. He's one of the great professionals in the field of comics. And those three books coming out on the same day. And I was like, wow, there really is a sword and sorcery renaissance going on. But it's not just in prose. It's in comics too. It might be bubbling in film too. That Dungeons and Dragons movie recently.
The Northman.
I didn't record, but it did pretty well apparently. And you're seeing more things like the Northman. Yeah. You're seeing a lot of these great shows like Britannia. I thought Britannia was the greatest sword and sorcery TV show ever made. And the sorcery creeps in on you. It's not obvious from the first, but really we're talking about Romans versus Druids. So, and the Druid stuff gets wild and wacky, and it's a real trip of a show. So, and seeing people online and seeing what the success that DMR has had, Dave Ritzlin's company, reviving old source and sorcery, finding new sword and sorcery. It's undeniable that there's something happening there, but I don't know as much about it as other people. So I see it happening, and I hope that Howard's book just opens the floodgates to the general public. That's kind of what we're all hoping here, is that he's going to ride that ship straight into the mainstream waters, and then we'll get more of this stuff, on the bookshelves.
Well, more people can make their living doing this.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about this, Scott?
I have a couple. Now, Howard has actually been doing this in the mainstream since 2007 at a major New York publisher. He has been writing sword and sorcery the entire time. He'll call it something else. He'll call it...
to sell it. He has to call it something else.
Sure. It doesn't matter what you call it as long as you get paid for it. That's the whole point of it. He has been carrying that banner for years. And people are, I get that the Bane deal is exciting, but he has been doing this for years. And the community...
Isn't the Bane deal, Scott, isn't that the first time he was able to sell it as sword and sorcery without having to give it a euphemism?
No, he sold it originally as sword and sorcery. They didn't market it as sword and sorcery.
The Hanavar series?
No, the Beer and Nassim.
Yeah.
No, the Beer and Nassim.
Yeah. But he couldn't call that sword and sorcery. You know what I mean? But
no,
now he's really open about calling
the editor didn't call it sword and sorcery.
Oh, it's the editors.
Right, but the editor chose not to call it sword and sorcery. So he called it, and that's what it was. It was sword and sorcery. But and I get that the Bane deal is important, but a lot of times the community will not follow the author to the larger publishers because it does not look like their traditional sword and sorcery. It's not marketed. Marketing of sword and sorcery means nothing. The sword and sorcery community is a tiny, tiny fraction of fantasy. You have to get the larger community of fantasy if you want to make a living at it. So if you have to tell them that it's Japanese manga for them to pick it up and buy it, God bless you, go do that. But it's still sword and sorcery. But there's just a subculture of sword and sorcery fans that if it does not have a naked woman on the front of it, they won't buy it. And they don't believe it's sword and sorcery. And This is just one of those. It's one of those little things that just pisses me off because I've been writing Sword and Sorcery at St. Martin's Press since 2010.
Yeah.
But it did not look like Frazetta. It actually, unfortunately, because you don't get a say in what the publisher puts on the cover, it kind of looked like a Daniel Silva thriller. But the content is still Sword and Sorcery. So.
Right.
You're talking about the old adage that you can't judge a book by its cover, but people do.
Well, that's all they do now.
Yes, they judge it
too. Yeah.
I wonder if the toxicity of the brand, the name, like I like Clonans, I like the classic pulp Sword and Sorcery. Like I said, I'm the hog at the trough. I'll eat everything. But with that said, like I think there is this idea that like, oh, as a marketing term, it's not very useful. I'm hoping that like some of that's going away. Like you saw Kagan the Damned by John Marbury, and it was initially described as a Sword and Sorcery novel, but then I feel like they like retreated on that.
Yes, they backtracked it in mid-marketing.
Yeah,
because the early marketing stuff had Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah,
and then when it came closer to the release date, they took Sword and Sorcery out and put Heroic Fantasy in.
Because it ain't Sword and Sorcery. Sorry, I read it. His story in here is the best Sword and Sorcery story in here, and I'm almost done. And this is not to be negative, not my book. I'm very disappointed.
By the way, I really like Kagan the Damned. I read that too. I read the first one. I know there's a second one now, but
great book. But again, 10 years ago, and Lou Anders and Jonathan Strahan did the Swords and Dark Magic, called it the new Sword and Sorcery. It wasn't. Sorry, it was great. It was great stories, great heroic adventure stories, but it was not the new Sword and Sorcery.
Well, a lot of it was old Sword and Sorcery.
Problem. Well, but that's the general problem with the term Sword and Sorcery. There's no, and I hate to use the word gatekeeping on it, but there is no gatekeeping to keep people from using the term Sword and Sorcery to apply to a Harry Potter clone.
Right.
And that's what's muddying the waters. It's not the actual Sword and Sorcery content, because people seem to like the content. It's like Grimdark, but not shitty.
This is why I really like
Grimdark.
I really like the term New Age Sword and Sorcery. And I thought that would be a good label for what Howard's doing, for what any of us are doing with it, updating it for modern sensibilities. That's basically what we're doing. But that hasn't caught on either, because people are saying, no, it's contemporary. It's not New Age. Why does it have to be New Age? People just don't want to be labeled. They don't want to buy into any labels. But I think you're right. There's a core people who, unless it looks like the stuff that came out in the 60s and 70s, with the Cringing Maiden and the Noble Warrior. But I like to point out to people that even that changed in the late 70s, because you had women with swords now.
Yeah.
And they weren't cringing anymore. They were up there fighting. Lynn Carter on the cover of, as far back as Year's Best Fantasy number 6, 1980, had a woman who killed a giant. It's one of my favorite paintings by Josh Kirby. And that just didn't happen at the time. Sword and Sorcery was, women weren't the heroes, despite Red Sonja. You were right. There was always this on Savage Sword of Conan. There was always the cringing female and then the heroic male. Yep. Well, that's gotten a lot better. That's part of the whole new Edge thing, that women characters are now more essential and have more agency, and they should. Also, there's the diversity angle, which we're trying to bring into Sword and Sorcery, because there wasn't a lot of diversity in the 20s and 30s. I hate to tell you, kids, but there is now. So let's embrace it, right? I just think it's a marketing tool, and you hit the nail on the head again, Scott. Sword and Sorcery was an effective marketing tool in the 60s and 70s. It is no longer an effective marketing tool. It's still a good label for certain types of fiction, but it's not going to move any copies beyond that core that wants things to, be like they used to be.
Well,
but we have to be more than nostalgia.
Our challenge, and I say this all the time, and I dislike it, because if Frazetta was alive and I could afford a cover, I'd buy a fucking Frazetta cover in a heartbeat. But our challenge is this: everybody outside of the writing world of Sword and Sorcery categorizes Sword and Sorcery by Frazetta covers and Arnold Schwarzenegger's '82 movie. we like it on the inside, but on the outside, when that's all it's called or seen as, it will never. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how we get beyond that. Things we don't want to give up, but we need to if we're going to expand. Because those are the first two things people think of, and then Conan O'Brien is number 3. But I have argued from the beginning.
We could always have a secret handshake.
I'm sorry. Yeah, secret handshake. Yeah,
Secret handshake.
What if we got Conan O'Brien to do a sword and sorcery movie? That'd be great.
That'd be awesome. But I have argued from the beginning that to me, there is a direct line from all of modern entertainment to sword and sorcery to Howard.
Yeah.
WWE, Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage, all of those are sword and sorcery heroes. Many individualistic players in all of our professional sports are direct lines to sword and sorcery heroes. All of our role-playing games, most of our tabletop games and board games now, many movies, even our thrillers, you can trace them all back to the characteristics of the lone Western or sword and sorcery hero. I think all of modern entertainment, even race car drivers, shoot, man, when you're individualistic and never say die attitude can be traced all the way back, I think, to Howard. I think he is the father of American fantasy. Yes, definitely the father of sword and sorcery, and that touches on everything. So I don't know. I don't know how we get past the mental image of Frazetta covers and Schwarzenegger's accent to get people to read it. I agree with you guys. They're throwing sword and sorcery on George Martin and on J.K. Rowling, and I don't like it because it dilutes the meaning then. Because if everything can be it, then it means nothing other than, oh, yeah, that furry diaper guy that Frazetta painted,
I think as a term.
And unfortunately, Amazon is the problem. So, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, Amazon is part of the problem.
Yep.
Algorithms.
Let anybody put it.
I almost debated setting up the info for my book for this Neither Beg Nor Yield. I tongue-in-cheek, but seriously considered putting it in like Crocheting 101 category, just so I could be number 1. Because there's no restriction. Whatever I want to call it is the category I can put it in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, I think as a term for organizing an online community, it seems to be very successful. Like a small online community, like it works. As a term for marketing literary commodities to a mass audience, it doesn't seem very effective. But I wonder if that can change. Hopefully it can change. Because I often think of I don't think, obviously, I'm going to make a controversial claim. I think that most of the people who like sword and sorcery, write sword and sorcery, tend to be guys. It's a kind of male genre. That's not saying that women don't write it, women don't read it. My wife loves sword and sorcery. She loves Robert E. Howard. But I just wonder if a lot of it has to do with male readership. Guys don't really read all that much anymore. The majority of the readership, if you go to Barnes and Nobles, the majority of the people buying books from a Barnes and Nobles tend to be women. And I wonder if the genre is kind of, it appeals to men, but the sad thing is that men aren't reading all that much anymore. You guys have any thoughts about that kind of lens?
That's a great point. And I'd like to share an anecdote. When my first novel came out, Seven Princes in 2012, the great Richard Anderson did a great cover for it. And it's kind of a cross between modern and classic because it's a silhouette of the 7 warriors. And I said, look, we got to have a woman on this cover because one of the main viewpoint characters is a woman. Mm-hmm. It's an ironic twist because it's called Seven Princes, but one of the main key characters is a woman. And a lot of these princes are her brothers, right? And they said, oh, no, we found that women, I forget how it was they put it. We don't need a woman on the cover because we found that women who like fantasy, they're used to seeing only men on the cover. And I thought, I don't buy that for a second. I think when you see yourself represented, you're more interested in it. And I see this from my students every day. If I show a movie and it's got all white people in it, I don't care if it's Hitchcock, I don't care if it's Kubrick, they're going to be less interested than if they can see themselves and people that look like them in it. You know what I mean? It's just, there's more buy-in. So I've always wanted to have, I wanted to get away from this, you just write for guys. You write guys fiction. If I do, I've failed because I'm writing for humans, not for one subsection of humanity, So it's interesting to me that you bring this point up. It may be there. It may be that we need more women writers and we need more women on the covers, and it just needs to be more friendly to possible audiences. I don't know. And I don't want to get into politics, but this is something to consider when you're trying to market anything, is who are you going to reach,
This is exactly what I did with this. You never put your character with his back to the cover. Never. Otherwise, the urban romances that had the women's asses always toward us in the tight leather pants in the 90s. And
Frazetta did that a lot.
But I did this on purpose because I wanted everybody to be able to be this character. You can't see a face or skin color. Okay? But yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying.
Well, I as I tried to interrupt you there, Frazetta did that quite often. He would put the character, the back of the character, because he wanted you to see the action in the world.
Yeah, and the glute.
But after him,
it's more for the glutes. More for the glutes.
Yeah. Sometimes he went a little crazy with the butt muscles, but beyond that, But it's funny because when that same book first came out, I think it was Scott Andrews asked me. He said, "I really like this. Is this Pulp Fiction?" And I said, "I don't know. I didn't know how to process that question. It was just the ultimate novel that I wanted to write for so many years, and I wrote it. And I don't know what it is. Some people loved it, some people hated it, But he said, "Is this Pulp Fiction?" And it rocked my world for a couple of weeks because I was like, "Is it? No, yes, maybe."
I guess this question is about if first off, this is an assumption that we could deny that it appeals mostly to men. Other people are like, that's not the case. But with that said, there is this idea that maybe the readership of Sword and Sorcery needs to grow. To sharpen the question, how might we do that? Is that even something that writers can even try to do? Is it on the marketers to do that, not writers? But do you have any thoughts about this, Scott? Like how to make Sword and Sorcery more appealing, or is it not even your job as the writer just to write, or what do you think?
No, it's the writer's job to appeal to as many readers as possible. You want to write something that the cross-section of readers will enjoy. Male, female, doesn't matter. I think with Sword and Sorcery, it's going to take somebody like Howard or somebody else with a major publishing deal to reach the New York Times list for it to be taken seriously. I love the small press. The small press is where the action happens, but the respect, not really respect, but the notice comes from the large press.
Yeah, the viral notice.
Large presses,
the social contagion.
They have the ability, the social contagion and the reach. A book like Howard's has to be physically in every single bookstore. It has to have people hand selling it. The marketers at Bain have to know which places to hand sell it to get it onto the New York Times list. And that cachet will hopefully carry over to the rest of us as we take our stuff out broadly. But he has, a book like that has to make it to the list. It has to show the world it has legs beyond the 50 fantasy fans that hang out at Whetstone.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question if I can, because both of you have more intimate knowledge on this than I do. But I understand what you're arguing, Scott. But the New York Times, the USA Today list, the Amazon list, even, which is more popular, so I'll knock that down. And those don't matter to me anymore, frankly. And I want to know how many you really think you guys think of your readers that matters to. Because, for example, most people I know don't give a crap about the Hugos anymore. As an author, you do, but we don't. I would think that one viral incident, this guy up in, I don't know if you guys heard of it, but here in Texas, a self-publishing author in Austin he was sitting at a table all by himself, and just some guy felt sorry for him and put him on his thing, and he gets like 30,000 hits and 29,000 purchases in the next 24 hours. That's what Howard needs.
The biggest
viral exposure.
He needs, he needs the biggest effect.
Yeah.
The dude, he's fan of some anime. He gets online. He doesn't even have a massive following, but he tweets about it, and they are suddenly on the New York Times list. But the thing about the New York Times and the USA Today lists are not the fact that they're on the list, but you have to have a metric shitload of sales to get on that list.
Okay. Gotcha.
So,
okay.
And so if you're on that list.
Go ahead, Scott.
But if you're on that list, that means you are reaching a broad cross-section of readers. You know, yes, it's nice to be able to stick, New York Times bestseller on your book, but that's secondary to the fact that you have just done the real-world version of going viral.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, good point.
Yeah, remember the old saying, nothing succeeds like success. So what we need to get Sword and Sorcery popular again is a massive success. And I'm sure that's what Bane is hoping for. That's what I'm hoping for, Howard.
Not in comics, not in movies. We've proven time again that there is hardly any overlap between people that read books and watch movies and people that read comics and read books. The novella at Marvel, you would think it's a Savage Sword of Conan story. You would think it would have a ton of readers. Readers did not read the prose story. They collected the magazine, but they did not read the story because they don't read prose a lot of times. Because, like you'd said, a lot of these people that read the comics are young men. They don't read prose a lot.
Man, a lot of comic comic collectors I know don't even read their comics. They just buy the 20 variants and put it on they bag and board them. And just,
which let me tell you,
they think someday down the road it'll be.
I'm sorry.
That tack doesn't work in book publishing. I made that mistake with Rage of the Behemoth. I'm probably still paying for that one.
So with that said, kind of have this idea. We're trying to, if the community exists, we're trying to kind of propagate the community. What's one piece of advice regarding the continued health of the the sword and sorcery literary renaissance that you might offer? Is there a particular publisher that we should support? A particular community to participate in? Here's a question: Should we be on social media more or less? Like, how do we make this? If you're just a fan, if you're just maybe an aspiring writer, like how do you help the sword and sorcery community flourish? Do you have any advice to offer? Maybe start with John. I don't know.
Just write good shit. Write fucking good stories that people want to read. There's no substitute for quality. Just write it, man, and get it out there.
And don't worry about what it's called. Just write it.
Don't worry about labels.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to give you a label, whether you like it or not. Yep. Just write the best damn story you can and then do it again and then keep on doing it. And when people tell you you're fucking crazy for doing it, keep doing it. Because the only way you win this game is by winning the long game. Scott, you've written about this a lot on your blog. You just got to stay in the game, man, or you're never going to win it. And
this is not a sprint.
Yeah, it's not about winning. It's about the journey. It's about the writing. If you love the writing, you love doing it, then you're going to do that. And it helps if you have a good day job, because you can always quit your day job if you get successful as a writer. But 99.9% of writers keep their day jobs. It doesn't mean they're not writing great stuff, but it's how it goes today,
And also get over the fact, number one, that anybody is anybody's competition.
Right.
John is not my competition. I'm not John's competition. Jason is not my competition. We are not competing deathmatch style for X number of slots.
Right.
Jason has a certain amount of stories he can fit in each book. He has an idea of what he wants in those stories. You send him your best, and he'll either love it or he won't. If he doesn't, you send it to the next person and to the next person. Don't stop sending because you get rejected. That's stupid. You're going to get rejected hundreds and hundreds of times. Toughen it up. Just keep sending out to, the small presses, medium presses, large presses. I mean, if you feel you have skill set to self-publish, knock yourself out. It's harder than it looks, and it is no longer the Wild West of first started, where you could self-publish something and it could be like popular the next day. That doesn't happen as much anymore because of the sheer glut of stuff. But John had it right. Write the best damn thing you can. Don't worry if what it's called as a label, but also know what's being published at the time. So if you write a story that's the best damn story you can about half-naked women riding across the plains, be aware
on dinosaurs.
Be aware that most places are not going to publish that today, in this day and time.
Right.
So be aware of the markets. Don't write to the market because you can't predict it.
Yeah.
But know what? Read the room. Let's read the room.
I would say you never write for the market, but write for the times.
Yeah.
In other words, don't try to sound like you wrote your shit in 1923. It's not going to sell in 2023, So a lot of what we do is in this fantasy realm is pulling the stuff we really love from that old stuff, but filtering out the stuff that doesn't work and adding in new things that make it more. I guess the word is contemporary.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jason?
And you can't really. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, Scott, please finish.
Well, I was just, you can't really hang something on the racism of the past. You can't write Conan today or certain Conan stories won't fly today. And just be aware of which ones are which.
The Veil of Lost Women.
That would be my prime example. Would be that one. So, it's
that's one of my. That's a small pet peeve of mine, and I'm gonna misquote it. So, John, I'm gonna ask you to say it again. So just so I get all the words. The definition of the new edge sword and sorcery. You said it earlier. It's been bandied around several times. What's the words in there again?
I'm not too sure. I can't remember the exact words of the motto, but it's jettisoning old worn out ideas and embracing new ideas as we bring in the things we love from traditional sword and sorcery fantasy, and then make it fit for modern consumption. Right.
So basically that's the gist of it. And I got to tell you, that irritated me from the first time I saw it on, because I don't get stories. I'm not in the whatever publisher world that got those shitty stories, honestly. I don't get stories. I've never gotten a story that's not written for contemporary times. So my very first reaction to that statement was, who's writing that shit? I've never seen it. I don't go looking for it, and no one has sent it to me. So I don't like that definition, because to me, no one was writing that. I never saw it. So that bothered me a lot, because it's throwing on a whole bunch of criteria that didn't need to exist, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So you never got a story submitted to you and you're like, wow, this is wildly racist or wildly sexist?
Nope. I never have. I have gotten totally wrong stories, fairy tale, things that don't fit what I wanted to publish at all, psychological pieces, nonfiction pieces, but I have never gotten blatantly racist, not once.
Not to get negative, but
sexy stories, but I don't think I've ever had sexist stories.
It's weird because in the fiction, it's kind of hard to say, but like in the the online discussion, like sometimes it can get pretty raw there, but that doesn't have anything to do with the stories being written.
They don't match.
Yeah. I think that for the largest part, people who are really racist and sexist and backwards probably don't write stories and submit them.
Or they're on those secret submission panels, and the anthologies I'm never going to look at twice, things like that. But
now I know some of the stuff I used to get from the literary agency. A lot of it was sexist, and there was some racist, but this was not fantasy. This was mainly a lot of mainstream type stuff. And there, not a vast amount, but one guy did send me his white supremacist novel.
Yeah.
So,
ouch.
Yeah. But even if I had gotten one or two of those, that still, in my opinion, would have been an anomaly. versus
they're fringes.
everyone that I know currently writing is writing to current market, and they're not portraying any of these negative aspects that came with the 1920s and 30s stories. So that wasn't a worry or concern for me. I'm not against the word contemporary, but when you add all that, I don't like that.
The worst thing that
Good point.
I'm like, my thing is like, if you even give Wingnuts like attention, it's like, maybe we'll edit this part out when I say this, but if you give Wingnuts any attention or you even start complaining about it, like they've already kind of won, and you know, so I'm like, my thing is like, oh, that's fucking weird. Moving on, you know, like if it's like,
then that becomes the problem. You know, how do you change that perception? And I think again, the story, it's in the success. You know, if Howard's book succeeds massively, people are going to see that this book is got the flavor, but it's not got all the bad stuff. It's, you know, it's contemporary. It's not problematic.
Right.
And I hate that word problematic, but it's used a lot these days, you know. You know, every man's
Howard does know that he's carrying all of our expectations, right?
Yeah, but he's kind of always done that, you know. He's been the forerunner of this ever since Flashing Swords, you know.
Yeah.
Remember Flashing Swords, the online mag he did?
I do, yeah.
So
went on to Blackgate, and the rest is history.
I have a couple more questions. Is that okay if I ask just maybe one?
Sure.
And then kind of the last question will be the generic, where can we find your work? What are you looking forward to? That sort of thing. So this is my last kind of substantive question is, a lot of SNS readers are also aspiring writers. Can you, what are some one or two craft advice snippets that you can provide those aspiring writers?
Can I go first?
Oh, yeah, please.
Can I go first on this one?
Absolutely.
Because I'm going to give you, aspiring writer, the lesson I needed to learn. Do not sit down to write a sword and sorcery story. Okay? Just sit down and write a story. If you read sword and sorcery, it's going to infuse your writing. If you read heroic action, adventure, fantasy in any form, it's going to infuse your story. And then, second, finish the story. Don't self-edit. Don't pause to create the background and the world history or the character history. Write your story. 4,000, 7,000, 17,000, whatever words it is. Then worry about if you need to fill in background. And then when you do that, you tweak it and you edit it. Then go, is this sword and sorcery? I don't know. It feels like it is to me. Let my readers decide. Whatever path you pursue. But don't sit down, like they said, to write to market. Don't write to genre. Write your freaking story. If you love sword and sorcery, odds are really good it's going to be really strong in sword and sorcery, and it could very well be, but don't worry about it. That's my advice.
I like that. Scott.
Oh, it's Scott. Scott.
Oh, so John.
I was just saying Scott.
Oh.
Okay.
I'm not a very good moderator.
No.
Probably my best. You're fine. My best advice is probably there are no rules, so don't worry about breaking them. There's a lot of guidelines, a lot of suggestions, but don't worry so much about rules. But do worry about things like learn how to manuscript, learn how to judge the length of a work before you start. Don't just sit down and start writing without any idea of where you're going. You'll end up you'll not finish it. You know, try to have, you don't have to plot it out, but have a beginning and an end in mind. If the magazine calls for 7,000 words, learn through reading 7,000 word stories what the pace of a 7,000 word story is, and mimic that. Don't. You know, I always tell people don't sit down and start your first book and expect it to be a 15-volume fantasy epic. You know, learn learn what the market bears. You know, with debut novels now, they don't want 140,000 words unless it's like the finest 140,000 words ever written. Nowadays, they want 80 or 90,000 words. So learn how to write a self-sufficient, standalone 90,000 word novel. And I know most novels aren't sword and sorcery, but don't worry about it. If you can write a sword and sorcery novel, so did Robert E. Howard. It's called Hour of the Dragon. So, it will work at 90,000 words also. And just, don't worry about breaking the rules. Just get it done.
I like that.
Yeah, both good points. I'd like to add something I read from Hemingway, who said every story is like an iceberg. You only see this little bit of it at the top. And as a writer, you know all that stuff at the bottom. You know way more than you're ever going to tell your reader, because if you do, you end up with giant chunks of exposition and they stop reading. So work all that in little bits, into the story. Don't start with a history lesson. Don't throw in a history lesson at any point. Once you're deep in the story, you might have time to give a little chunk of history or something, but only when it's relevant, only when it comes up in the natural course of telling the story. So remember, you're going to know way more about this than your reader ever does. And your reader doesn't need to know a lot of these things. And those things can come out in future stories if you're writing about the same world again.
Right.
But I heard that analogy and I thought, wow, that's proof that he was a great writer right there. Yep. My other thing is find good books on writing and devour them. One of the books that changed my world was Robert Silverberg wrote a book called Worlds of Wonder. And I read it in college when I was first getting into writing. And he goes back through some classic science fiction stories and tears them apart to see what makes them work. And man, is that a powerful book. And even though it's science fiction, it works just as well for fantasy. Some of the stuff's very fantasy flavored in there. Part of it is, if you ever read Brian Aldiss's Hot House, it's basically a fantasy, but it's marketed as science fiction. Anyway, Silverberg did that great book. And there were other books, some of which I can't even remember the names of. But that's one thing I was always on the outlook for, is like, oh, it's a book on writing. It's a book on writing fantasy. That doesn't mean that it's going to tell you everything you need to know. It just means that it will give you some great ideas of what you should and shouldn't do, and it will inspire you as you read about that. And the third thing is just read a lot, and read outside your genre, and realize that stories are stories, no matter what genre they're in. And just, and if something is, this last part might be for more advanced writers, but this one I heard from Alan Moore, the great comic writer. He said, if something scares you as a writer and you're not sure you can do it, you're bound to attempt it. So if you try to do it, if you're challenging yourself as a writer, then you'll never get bored with writing. So if you're like,
that means I'm actually going to be writing a cozy fantasy.
Oh, really? Cozy fantasy? What is that again?
See, I don't understand that at all.
Is it like a fantasy where
it's
there's
a fantasy that's not
violence or anything?
It's no violence and low stakes.
Oh, okay.
I understand a cozy mystery, so very similar to that, I guess.
Very similar, yeah.
The mill worker makes bread. The mill worker makes fantasy bread, and helps the poor old woman get better. And
I don't have bread makers on the wall behind me here, boys.
I mean, I think it's. I mean, a lot of Tolkien is cozy fantasy, like those Shire chapters. Yeah.
Okay, that's true.
And if you really want to get granular with it, Mary Renaud's The Praise Singer is cozy historical fiction.
Oh wow! Okay.
If you've never read it, it's right up there with the cozy fantasy. So, yes.
You mentioned books on writing. And Scott, I'm sorry, John. You mentioned books on writing. Scott mentioned Stephen R. Pressfield as an influence. Stephen R. Pressfield has this kind of writer's motivation book called The War of Art. Yeah. Has anybody read that? Like, I love that. I've read that so many times. It's like, like a. I have not. There you go. Yeah, it's like, can I get you pumped up to write? It's really cool.
Yeah.
So
he's got a whole series of them.
Oh, he does.
Oh, yeah. There's one called Turning Pro, Do the Work.
Oh yeah.
There's another one, The Fool's Cap Method, I think is what it's called. Your Authentic Swing. He's got a bunch of them.
Well, one more important thing for anybody who's what they call aspiring writer or beginning writer, join a writers group, because that has been very fruitful for me in the past too. It's where you can share your work with others at the same level or maybe a little bit higher, and you get to share you get to give your comments on their work and just workshop it. It's a lot of fun. It inspires you. Plus it gives you a little bit of that feedback before you're ever published. You can get a good feeling from, hey, we all liked your story. Now here's the part that needs work, and that's valuable. And you get it for free if you join a writers group.
Right. So now I want to say two things. I teach a writing class the last Thursday of every month here in Boerne. And one of the things I teach, talking about writing groups, is yes, very heavily encouraged to be in it, but also know what everyone's audience is. At a certain point, if you're going to be submitting and no one in that writers group is submitting audience, you need a different writers group. You need to be with people who will be submitting to editors and publishers for critical review. Second, what I wanted to tie into is what John said a long time ago, and I forgot to mention this, but this is good for the aspiring writer. Emotions, the senses. Evoke the senses in your writing. The two most important are sound and smell. You will eventually, as an advanced, accomplished writer, incorporate all five at some point, taste probably being the most difficult, but sound and smell is what evokes our memories. If you can get someone to smell or hear something in your story, they will connect with your character or your story, and they will buy in, and they will finish it, and they will buy more. So sell those two emotions.
Very good advice. Yeah. You have to paint that picture without using all five senses. You can't just rely on visual. The whole thing, and some beginning writers, a lot of beginning writers, they rely on basically what's the visual, but
they don't paint the picture at all. A lot of them just will not paint a visual picture at all. So
they just tell.
As a complete dilettante writer myself, I shouldn't be giving advice to anybody, but the one piece of advice I will, and I give this to my undergraduate writers, is submit stories for rejection, not for acceptance. Assume they're going to be rejected. And then when you get an acceptance, it's like a surprise. So just kind of erase that part of your mind that feels like you're. So if you have a finished manuscript, why not submit it? The worst case scenario, you're going to get a form rejection. Best case scenario, you're going to get personal feedback that might help your story further. So
and when you get that rejection, you send it out the same day or the next day. Don't sit there and wait on it. Don't start revising it because you got one rejection. Get 10 or 20 before you start thinking, well, then maybe this sucks. Because as much as I love you, Jason, your opinion of my story is just an opinion.
Oh, yeah,
yes,
it is.
It's informed, but it's not. It's your.
No, it's the opinion. No, I'm just playing.
I know. He's talking about me because he's writing for me.
Oh, I see.
So at the moment, it is the opinion that matters, but you were given, I asked for something, you're trying to write to it, you probably will write to it, there shouldn't be a problem, but on the off chance, but, a little aside, if I don't reject Cook, I'm not rejecting Oden.
You haven't read it, just wait.
I believe it was Warren Ellis, another comic writer, who said his best advice was, sometimes editors are wrong.
Yeah.
You tend to think the editor, the all-powerful editor. Sometimes the editor just doesn't like your style or doesn't like your flavor.
Yeah.
I've had that 100 times
because
or
it's
more.
rejected doesn't make it a bad story.
Right.
But you feel like it is. When you get rejected, you're like, oh, this piece of shit, how can I write it?
Right.
But then the next day, you're like, fuck him, man. That's a good story. And then you go.
No, I don't wait till the next day.
Until you delete the story or sell it.
For me, it's the same day. I'm like, you rejected it? Well, fuck you. I'm going to send it off to these people.
That's my initial response.
Well, I am I'm fighting that story right now myself, boys. I think the best thing I've ever written has been rejected 3 times. It's currently out waiting for its 4th rejection, but I'm starting to get a complex because I really think it's the best short story I've ever written. Well,
just keep it out there, man. That's a good thing. You got it out there again. So
So to conclude, last question: what should people know about your current writing projects? Where should they find your work? What do you think they should look out
Wait
And
a minute,
obviously,
wait a-
I know.
wait a minute.
Neither beg nor yield. We're going to talk about that. So
Okay.
maybe say, I'm not sure what you want to say about your contribution to the to this anthology, but this is the occasion of this panel is the anthology. Maybe that can be part of this answer. So,
All right.
Scott.
Well, I'm currently working on my story for Neither Beg Nor Yield,
Okay.
which Jason did ask for a very specific type of story,
Mm-hmm.
but he actually asked me for an even more specific type of story in the email. He wanted a story of the Phoenician.
Mhm.
So
That's awesome.
he is actually getting, and I'll go ahead and tell him this now, he is getting a direct sequel to Men of Bronze.
Okay.
He is
All right.
because I went back and reread it. I never reread my stuff. I didn't actually specify that he died.
Yeah. Okay.
So you are getting a direct sequel 29 years later inside
Very cool.
1,000 words.
That sounds awesome.
Very cool.
I
All
love
right.
Men of Bronze.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's called The Beast of Sekhmet. So
Okay. We got a name. All right.
we'll wait
I
and see.
asked everybody.
It's a slow burn,
very
man.
specifically.
This is
John.
okay. I didn't know if you asked everybody a specific
I asked
type of
everybody
story.
very specifically for something, and I got 90. I'm going to say 92, 93% yes. A couple of them were rights things I couldn't get, and one of them I wanted really, really, really bad. Okay, Cook, Glenn Cook, Black Company, first book. Remember the character Raven?
Yeah.
He's in the first quarter of the first Black Company book. I loved Raven.
I love Raven.
Scared the shit out of me. I've always been fascinated with Raven. I have had conversations with Cook at conventions about Raven. I asked Cook for Raven's origin story or end of life story. I got back from Cook. I have thought about that twice in my career, and I will never write Raven again because he scares me.
Wow. Well, by Alan Moore's advice, he should write that
I
story.
know. You should write that story.
But let's see. About 3 years ago, I quit writing short stories to really focus on novels. I wrote 2 novels, and they're still in limbo. You know, hopefully they'll sell. But I just came back to writing short stories, and so I had this story in Book of Blades Volume 1, which introduced the character of Nori the Hammer Fist. And Jason's book came along at just the right time because I just decided this summer to get back into writing short stories. And the first one I wrote was Nori's origin tale. So, and this appearing, I hadn't planned it to appear in another anthology. I just thought I could sell it to a magazine or something. But it's kind of cool that this character has jumped from one anthology to another anthology. And actually, we're going back about 40 years or so to when he's a boy learning about the world and himself. And it's really the kind of story. If you read the one in Book of Blades, he's like his early 50s, and his strength and he's kind of a legendary figure, right? And he's sort of in the waning years of his greatness. But I went back to the very beginning to set up like what happened to him that made him so, I guess the word would be superhuman. And it's kind of like he's not a wizard or anything, but he's got super strength and endurance. And along the lines of, say, Hercules, right? I didn't model him after Hercules, but there's some parallels. And it's not because his father was a god or anything. It's because his mother was a sorceress. And she, in order to help her people, without giving too much away, she designed him as this sort of living weapon through her sorcery. And it took many, many years. And there's a heavy cost to that. And so I wanted to show that in the story so that when I come back to Nori the next time and maybe come back to him as an older guy, now we will know, right, how he got this way. And there's 30 years to fill in there too. So this is a character that I'm looking forward to exploring for a while and getting more. Also, as I mentioned in the interview that Jason sent me, I'm known for writing more like wizardly, intellectual type characters. And I wanted to write a character who was first and foremost a warrior, not some intellectually driven person, but a person who is driven by more practical matters, and not somebody who is. ambitious, right? Like somebody who's out to conquer a kingdom or something. He's more or less your kind of a man without a country, and he's got these skills that make him legendary, a legendary winner of battles, slayer of monsters. So my story explores how he got to be that way and the cost what did it cost him, and also it introduces his mother, who's a fascinating character because, as I just mentioned, I love to write about sorcerers and wizards and that kind of stuff. So I kind of got best of both worlds in this story, and hopefully it will be the second of many more Nori stories.
Sounds awesome.
So thanks, Jason, for asking me.
A little bit indomitable will and nonchalant mercenary motivation.
There you go.
That's where that's from.
Kind of sounds like I mean, I know it's different, but immediately my mind goes towards Druss and his origin story. Like, where did Druss come from?
There you go.
Yeah.
But it's awesome.
You're talking about Jimmel's character?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. I read some Druss, but I haven't read a lot.
He doesn't
Same
have
here.
he doesn't have the sorcery
Element.
living weapon element, but
Mhm.
yes, I could see that comparison in the elder years.
One of the things I'm looking forward to exploring, because I'm 53 now, is as he goes through his 50s, I want his invulnerability and strength to begin to fade.
Oh, that's awesome.
In future stories, spoilers, I want to explore, how does a guy like this continue? What if Superman got old?
Yeah.
Right? What if Hercules got old? Would he still be as heroic? And I mean, would he be even more heroic? Right? Like, everybody thinks he can break a boulder with his hands, but he can't. He can barely lift it now, right? So that's kind of the direction I want to go. Meanwhile, I can jump back to Nori at his full strength days and explore that if I want. So there's a lot of potential there.
Interesting. I love this combination that I'm going to be able to spout and in neither beg nor yield. I'm getting a almost 30-year climactic return to one character, the origin story of another character. I love this.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be
a very cool anthology.
I think I know a couple of other authors who are going to be in there. I want to get you to confirm on this interview if they're going to be in there, but I'll refrain because you're probably not ready to.
Well, by the time this goes live, everyone's going to know who's in it, and sometime this week, today or tomorrow.
So can I ask my question if a certain route is going to be in it?
So hang on. This is in August, before the release of the campaign. So sometime in the week of August 10th, Joe Lansdale is going to be sharing the cover and the list of authors on his viral feed, which is awesome that he agreed to do that because he's got 30,000 people that follow him on Facebook alone, more on Twitter. So very appreciative of the exposure. So ask your question.
No, I was going to say Clint Werner. Is it Werner or Werner? Is he going to be in the
anthology? As far as I know,
anthology?
it's pronounced Werner with a W. Yeah.
Did
Werner.
I see he's going to be in the anthology?
There may have been a comment or two in Discord today that alluded to Hawking, Oden, and Warner being combined in one title.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
like a round robin story?
No.
No,
They'll be
It's all under the same cover.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I had. I mean, I had a few questions that we didn't get to, but we covered the territory. So yeah, this was awesome.
This was
A lot of fun, guys. Thanks for having me.